The Cold War and the European recovery after World War II. The Cold War begins. As you can see, the map of Europe changed greatly after World War II. After World War II, the Soviets set up pro-Soviet governments in the Eastern European nations that they had freed from Nazi control. Allies called for free elections in these areas, but Stalin refused. Stalin wanted to use Eastern Europe as a buffer zone against any further German attack. So he wanted to create this buffer zone of Soviet-influenced and controlled areas so that if the Germany rebuilt itself, it would have a much harder time getting to the center of Russia. Tensions over Germany. At the end of the war, each of the Allies had its own occupation zone in Germany. Great Britain, France, and the US joined their zones and formed the German Federal Republic, also known as West Germany. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Berlin, however, the capital, lay in the Soviet zone and was divided into East and West Berlin. The Soviets blockaded all roads and railroads leading into West Berlin. President Truman then ordered airlifts of food and supplies into West Berlin. The Soviets were forced to lift their blockades in response. The East German government built the Berlin Wall between East and West Berlin to stop East Germans from fleeing to freedom in the West. So basically, rather than giving the capital of Germany to the Soviets because it was in the Soviet zone, they decided to split Berlin into East and West Berlin, with the East Berlin being controlled by the Soviets and West Berlin being controlled by the other Allies. And then, so basically, the Soviets did not want people fleeing one side of the capital to the other, to the more free democratic side of West Berlin. So what he did was he blockaded all the roads and the railroads leading from East Berlin into West Berlin. This is then going to kind of starve out people in West Berlin, and they're not going to be able to get supplies because they're trapped in the Soviet zone. And so what happened was President Truman then ordered airlifts. So we flew in planes and we dropped food and other supplies into West Berlin. And so basically Stalin's plan didn't work, and so eventually they had to lift the blockade, but what they did in response was they built the huge Berlin Wall that divided East and West Berlin to keep people from East Berlin in, to keep them from fleeing, and then they set up Checkpoint Charlie, which was the checkpoint areas where people would have to drive through to go from one side to the other because they can control movement from East and West, between East and West Berlin. Now, the next policy dealing with the Soviets was containment. In the late 1940s, communist movements, aided by the USSR, seemed to be gaining power in China, Southeast Asia, and other areas. The U.S., in response, adopted a policy of containment. Part of this policy was something known as the Truman Doctrine. So President Truman sent aid to Greece and Turkey to help them defend themselves against communists trying to take over their governments. The Truman Doctrine was what was established. President Truman promised to aid any nation resisting outside domination under the Truman Doctrine. So basically, this was our policy statement, foreign policy, and it was like a philosophy of the president that said that any country that was dealing with an outside group coming in trying to dominate them, we would send some sort of aid to. And Greece and Turkey were having a lot of pressure by communist groups, pressure from the outside to be taken over by these communist groups. And so we sent aid to Greece and Turkey to help them resist this outside communist movement. Another prominent part of containment was the Marshall Plan. This was the United States' plan to contain communist movements in Western Europe specifically by giving billions of dollars of aid to help countries rebuild their shattered economies, the economies that had been shattered after World War II. In this theory, As economic and political conditions improved in these areas, the danger of a communist revolution in Europe decreased. So basically, communism is the spread of wealth and among all the people, right? It sounds good on paper and in ideology, but in practicality, we know that it takes away a lot of personal liberty. And so the idea was, in order to help people and help countries resist communism, that we would send aid to countries to help them rebuild their economies, which had been shattered after World War II, which would improve the living conditions for the people in Western Europe and therefore make communism less appealing for them. The Cold War also led to new military alliances. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established in 1949 by the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations that agreed to protect one another against an outside attack. In 1955, the Soviet Union basically responded to the formation of NATO by forming their own pact with 7 European nations, and they formed the Warsaw Pact, in which they agreed to help each other if any of them went to war. So basically what you have is you have the world being divided between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So you have two groups, the United States leading NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And of course now the Warsaw Pact has disintegrated, but NATO is still in existence. And some of the tension in the Ukraine is having to do with which countries are joining NATO and want to be a part of NATO. Because the Soviets don't like the strengthening of NATO. As we noted earlier, the United Nations was set up in 1945 as an international peacekeeping organization. Remember, it would replace the failing League of Nations after World War from World War I. The members in the United Nations agreed to submit disputes to the United Nations for a peaceful settlement and to work together to conquer hunger and disease. The UN has had limited success in solving conflicts because it can't force the members to agree to their decisions. So it has a hard time enforcing their decisions. Also, it has been successful, though, in helping developing nations combat disease and improved education. So while it hasn't done the best job with dealing with conflict between countries, it has done a good job in areas like social services. The rebuilding of Western Europe. After World War II, much of Europe, especially Germany, lay in ruins. Western European nations, with the help of the Marshall Plan and their own hard work, rebuilt their industries, transportation systems, and cities. We talk about this time being the German economic miracle, because with the strong leadership of Konrad Adenauer and their new industries, West Germans achieved one of the highest standards of living in Europe by the late 1950s. So within about 15 years, they go from complete ruins in West Germany to one of the highest standards of living in the world. France then suffered, though, from political instability and colonial wars in Asia and North Africa. Algerian nationalists battled for independence, and the war in Algeria led to the downfall of the French government, which was the Fourth Republic at that time, and it led to the creation of the Fifth Republic under Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle worked to restore France to a position of world leadership, and France then pursued an independent course among the Western allies. So this is when you see the French start having their own opinion and start seeking their own diplomatic policy independent of their allies. And you still see this today. While the French are still our allies, they don't always agree with us or with Great Britain on everything. They seek to remain independent. In Great Britain, they rebuilt factories and improved farm output. They also moved toward creating a welfare state, so they had a lot more social services. They introduced, for example, a national health service. They also expanded unemployment and old age pensions. Britain's colonial empire during this time dissolved, though, as many people in many lands won their independence. So basically, after World War II, most of what was left of the European colonies started fighting for independence because they felt like the opportunity was right, that people didn't want to fight anymore after such a big war, and that this was their best chance of gaining independence. And it really did start to occur after World War II. Western European nations then started to work together on their economy. One of the ways they did this was they formed the European Economic Community, also known as the Common Market, in 1957. and members of the EEC enjoyed fewer restrictions on trade and travel. So what the EEC did, which is very common now to the EU, was it enabled people to travel from one country to the next and to trade goods and services more easily between member nations to help improve the economy of Europe. At the same time, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were in a state of flux. Stalin launched a new round of political purges during the last years of his life that would have a devastating effect on the people of the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev, who's depicted here, became the new leader of the Soviet Union following Stalin's death. He criticized Stalin's cult of personality, this idea that he was larger than life, and led a period of reform known as de-Stalinization. Although many of Stalin's harsh policies were eased, the Soviet Union still remained a totalitarian state under Khrushchev. Among the Soviet satellite states, Yugoslavia sought and pursued an independent course under their leader Marshal Tito. Tito was a communist dictator. He did allow some economic and individual freedom. Tito was successful, however, in breaking away from direct Soviet control because Soviet troops at the time were not occupying Yugoslavia when he came to power, so they were not directly involved in Yugoslavia. In Hungary and Poland, two other Soviet satellites tried also to free themselves from Soviet domination. Gomulka, the Polish communist leader, made some reforms, but he continued to support Soviet foreign policy. Nagy in Hungary pursued a Western-style democracy and pledged to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact, and as a response, Khrushchev sent troops to Hungary and crushed the revolution. In the United States, several developments were occurring. The Cold War abroad led to a fear of communists at home. Senator Joseph McCarthy accused many government officials and others of being communists or communist sympathizers in the early 1950s. And although his allegations were later proven false, they created an atmosphere of suspicion that ruined the careers of many people. He really liked to say that people in Hollywood were secretly communists. That was a big thing. Immediately following World War II, Americans faced rising prices and strikes, but during the 1950s they experienced unprecedented prosperity. Black Americans, however, did not share in the prosperity of the 1950s, and in many parts of the United States they still experienced segregation. In the 1950s and 1960s, many black Americans demanded equality and civil rights. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional in the famous case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This is the separate is inherently unequal court case. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. also rose to prominence as one of the many black leaders to work to end segregation through nonviolent protests, marches, boycotts, and sit-ins. The Cold War dominated American foreign policy during the 1950s and the 1960s. In 1950, the Cold War heated up after communist North Korea invaded non-communist South Korea. The U.S., with the approval of the United Nations, came to the South Koreans' aid. And after 3 years of bitter fighting, a ceasefire was signed, leaving Korea a divided nation. And in fact, we still have a military base, a large military base in Korea on the demilitarized zone. The Cold War also extended into the Western Hemisphere after Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba and set up a communist government there. The U.S. backed anti-Castro rebels, so Castro allowed the Soviet Union to build missile launch pads in Cuba. And these missile launch pads were dangerous because those missiles, as you see there depicted in red, they were close enough to actually hit Florida. And so that was a very big concern. In a dangerous confrontation, later known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. forced the Soviets to dismantle their bases in Cuba. So we came very close to a nuclear war at this time. We sort of played a game of bluff, and eventually the Soviets backed down. This concludes the first part of your Cold War and European recovery notes.